All right, get ready, because we're going back in time to ancient Egypt, but not the glamorous Hollywood version.
Right.
Today, we're looking at something pretty real, a system that was essential to this powerful civilization.
Oh, yeah.
Slavery.
Absolutely.
And here's the thing.
Yeah.
Your sources are in Arabic, which is kind of fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. It's so interesting to see how these Arabic texts can reveal things about slavery in ancient Egypt.
Right, because it's a topic that's often misunderstood or controversial even.
Definitely. Full of misconceptions.
So let's jump right in. What's something surprising that these texts tell us about slavery in ancient Egypt?
Well, one thing that really stands out is that it wasn't just about brutal force, backbreaking labor.
Yeah.
It was really woven into their entire society, their economy, their religion, even their legal system.
Really?
For example, did you know that these texts say that slaves could actually testify in court?
Whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Really? That's incredible. I knew they used slaves for things like building pyramids and farming. But to think they had a voice in legal matters, that's amazing. Tell me more.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. It seems they can be called to testify in certain cases, maybe even give information about their masters. Now, of course, there were limitations.
I would imagine so.
Their status was still definitely lower, but it really changes our simple idea of what slavery was.
Yeah, I'm already rethinking everything I thought I knew. So just how important was slavery to ancient Egyptian society? Like, paint me a picture.
Okay, so imagine this Egypt's famous monuments, all the farmland, even those fancy houses of the wealthy.
Okay.
It all depended on this big system of slave labor, and it wasn't just muscle.
Right.
They did all sorts of jobs, from skilled crafts to housework.
So it was deeply ingrained in their world. Where are all these slaves coming from?
Well, the Arabic texts point to one main source: warfare.
Huh?
When they won battles, they took tons of prisoners and forced them into slavery.
Okay.
Like the wars against Nubia to the south. They got a lot of their slaves from there.
Nubia, I remember that name. Weren't those wars really brutal?
Well, they were. And very profitable for the Egyptians, unfortunately.
Wow.
Pharaoh Thutmose III, he ruled from 1479 to 1425 BC.
Right.
He led a bunch of successful campaigns into Nubia, captured thousands and thousands of prisoners who became workers in Egypt.
Thousands. Wow. It's hard to even grasp how big that was. And it wasn't just Nubia, though, was it?
No, the texts also mention fights with Palestine and even some with the Phoenicians across the Mediterranean.
Right across the sea.
These wars helped them gain land, but they also brought in a huge number of people forced into slavery. A human cost that's often forgotten in stories of conquest.
That's pretty chilling to think about. So was it all about conquering and enslaving their enemies, or were there other ways people ended up as slaves?
Sadly, yes. Debt and poverty were big problems. Imagine being so deep in debt that you have to sell yourself.
Oh, wow.
Or even worse, your family members into slavery just to survive.
That's just heartbreaking. I can't even imagine that kind of desperation.
It was a harsh reality for many people in ancient Egypt. It shows that slavery wasn't just about military power. It was deeply connected to their economic problems and their whole social structure.
This is really eye-opening, so different from what we usually hear. Okay, so with all these slaves from different places, what kind of work did they actually do?
Well, we have that classic image of slaves working on those massive pyramids and temples.
Right, back-breaking labor.
Yeah, under that hot desert sun. But these texts suggest that the reality was more complicated.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, think about it. Agriculture was what the Egyptian economy ran on.
Of course.
Slaves were essential for all those huge farms that fed the whole nation. They planted irrigated, harvested crops like wheat and barley.
Yeah.
I mean, could you imagine managing those giant fields without a massive workforce?
No way. It makes sense that they needed all the help they could get.
Exactly.
But what about those movie scenes where you see slaves building the pyramids? Were they really involved in those huge projects?
Oh, definitely. But it's not as simple as the movies make it seem. Recent research says that while they did use slaves, especially for tasks that needed brute strength, most of the workers on projects like the Great Pyramid of Giza, the one built during Pharaoh Khufu's reign from 2580 to 2560 BC,
Okay.
they might have actually been skilled laborers who were paid for their work.
Wait a minute. So even in ancient Egypt, people got paid for their labor?
Right.
I thought it was all about forced servitude.
It's surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
It seems like those big projects needed special knowledge and skills, and the Egyptians recognized that, even if it meant paying those people.
Okay. I'm starting to see just how complex all of this was. So besides the pyramids and the fields, where else did slave labor play a big role?
Let's move inside those wealthy homes. Domestic service was another big area where they used slaves. Imagine cooking, cleaning, taking care of children in a huge Egyptian household. That was the reality for many.
Wow. It's like they built their entire civilization on the backs of these enslaved people.
So tell me, what was life really like for these individuals? Were they totally at their owner's mercy? It's complicated, but these Arabic texts give us some interesting clues.
Okay.
While they were definitely seen as property and their lives were hard, they weren't completely without rights.
Really?
For instance, those who worked on royal projects.
Like building those fancy temples?
Yeah, maybe those. They sometimes got food rations and maybe even some kind of basic shelter as part of their service.
So there was a tiny bit of humanity in the system.
Yeah, and there's even evidence that slaves could get manumission.
Manumission.
That means being freed from slavery.
Right.
This could happen after a certain time of service, or if they showed amazing loyalty. It was more common for those who were originally prisoners of war.
So there was at least a chance, however small, of escaping that life. Did ancient Egypt have specific laws about slavery?
They did.
Wow.
These Arabic texts you've given me, they actually recognize slaves as property.
Right.
But they also hint at times when they could get some limited freedoms.
Interesting.
There were even laws about how they should be treated, although whether those were always followed is another question.
I bet. Can you give me an example from these texts that really brings this to life?
Definitely. Remember those huge Nubian campaigns led by Thutmose III?
Yeah, the ones with all those captives.
Right. Those weren't just military victories. They brought a lot of wealth to Egypt.
Okay.
And not just from expanding their territory, but from the forced labor of all those people they captured.
That's a pretty sobering reminder of what those conquests really cost.
It is. And here's another detail from these texts that blew me away. Sometimes slaves could actually help with legal matters.
Wait, you mean they had a say in the legal system?
Apparently so. It seems they could even be summoned to court to give testimony, maybe even about cases involving their own masters.
Wow, I'm starting to realize how little I actually knew about all this. This deep dive is already blowing my mind.
And we're just getting started.
Oh, wow.
There's so much more to learn about the lives of these people and how they shaped Egyptian society.
Yeah.
Especially through these Arabic sources you've brought.
This is incredible. This is fascinating. So you mentioned slaves testifying in court. What kind of cases did they get involved in?
Oh, that's the question, isn't it?
Right.
Sadly, the voices of the enslaved are often lost to history.
Yeah.
We have to try to understand their experiences from the things the elite wrote and the artifacts they left behind.
Right, which probably gives us a pretty biased view.
Definitely.
But maybe these Arabic texts can shed some light.
Maybe. They might. It could be worth looking into legal records from that time.
Okay.
To see if any transcripts mention slave testimonies. Even a tiny glimpse into their words would be so valuable.
I can imagine. Okay, so if these slaves were considered property, how did that actually play out in their daily lives? Were they all treated the same?
Well, that's where those simple ideas about slavery we have start to fall apart. It wasn't the same for everyone. These sources, especially the Arabic ones, suggest there were different levels of enslavement in ancient Egypt.
Oh, really?
For example, those who worked on royal projects like building those amazing temples we talked about.
Right.
They often had better conditions than those working in private homes.
Interesting. So serving the pharaoh directly came with perks.
It seems so. They were more likely to get regular food rations and maybe some kind of basic shelter provided by the state. Makes you think about the power dynamics, doesn't it?
Definitely. So even among the slaves, there was a pecking order based on who you served.
Exactly. And it probably went beyond just who owned you. Things like a slave's skills, where they were from, even their personality could affect how they were treated and the jobs they were given.
Makes sense.
Like a skilled craftsman, someone who could do intricate carvings or make beautiful pottery.
Yeah.
They might have a completely different life compared to someone forced to work in the fields under that brutal sun.
You know, it's making me think about those Hollywood movies again.
Yeah.
We talked about how those pyramid building scenes aren't totally accurate, but this adds another layer.
Right.
It wasn't just a crowd of nameless, suffering people.
No.
There are individuals with different skills and stories, and maybe even a bit of agency within this system.
You're right on. That's what makes history so fascinating. It's not about memorizing dates and battles. It's about understanding real people's lives. And in this case, the lives of people whose stories haven't been told.
Right. Speaking of individual stories, the outline mentions the Battle of Kadesh. Wasn't that a big deal?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That was the clash between Ramses II, one of Egypt's most famous pharaohs,
Yeah.
and the Hittites, a real turning point. And the Arabic sources say that a huge number of prisoners from that battle ended up as forced labor on those massive construction projects during Ramses II's time.
Wow. So even a pharaoh known for his huge monuments relied on slave labor to achieve his goals.
It seems so. And it shows how deeply slavery was tied to the politics and military of ancient Egypt. It wasn't just an economic thing, it was woven into their entire society.
It's a lot to think about. I'm trying to imagine what it must have been like to live back then, to be born into a world where your freedom was so limited, your life decided by someone else.
That's something historians think about a lot. It shows how important it is to study the past, even the bad parts, to understand how complicated human history is.
Definitely. We're learning about a civilization that achieved amazing things in engineering and art,
Right.
but we can't ignore the fact that those achievements were built partly on the suffering of people who were denied their basic freedom.
That's so important to remember. And it leads to a bigger question that I think our listeners should consider. How did having so many slaves affect the development of ancient Egyptian culture and their sense of who they were?
That's a good question. It's clear that slavery was a big part of their society, but how much did it shape their values, their worldview?
That's where things get really interesting. The presence of all those slaves must have had a huge impact on their society and culture.
Right.
Did it lead to a stronger sense of social hierarchy? Did it affect their religious beliefs?
And how did the Egyptians themselves justify slavery? Did they see it as morally wrong, or was it just an accepted fact of life?
That's something scholars still argue about. Unfortunately, we don't have many accounts from the slaves themselves. We have to rely on what the elite wrote and the objects they left behind to try to understand what it was like.
It's like solving a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But even with those limitations, I think we can learn a lot by carefully examining the evidence we do have.
Absolutely. And that's what makes history so exciting. It's always a work in progress. We're always discovering new things and reinterpreting the past.
Speaking of reinterpreting the past, did the Egyptian system of slavery ever face any challenges or resistance from within?
That's a great question, and one that deserves more attention. These Arabic sources don't mention any big rebellions,
Right.
but it's hard to imagine that a system based on forced labor didn't face any pushback.
Yeah, human nature says there must have been some kind of resistance.
Definitely. Even if it wasn't a full-blown uprising.
Right.
Think about subtle ways to defy the system, like slowing down work-breaking tools, even whispering words of dissent among themselves.
Right.
Those everyday forms of resistance are harder to track, but they were probably a big part of how slaves lived.
It's a powerful reminder that even in a system as oppressive as slavery, people found ways to resist to keep hope alive.
Exactly. And those acts of resistance, no matter how small, should be acknowledged and remembered.
I agree. It makes me wonder if there are any records of individual slaves who managed to gain their freedom or even become prominent despite their situation.
Now, that's a fascinating thought. It speaks to the resilience and agency of people, even in a system meant to take away their power.
Wouldn't it be incredible to find those stories to give a voice to the people history is often silenced?
It would be amazing.
Yeah.
And who knows what future discoveries might reveal about their lives.
Right.
Maybe these Arabic texts have some clues, or maybe future archaeological digs will shed some light on their stories.
It just goes to show there's always more to learn, more layers to uncover when it comes to history, especially when we're using these unique Arabic sources.
I couldn't agree more. And that's what makes studying the past so endlessly fascinating. It's all about discovery and reevaluation.
Makes you think, right? How could something so awful be such a normal part of their world? It's like we can still feel the effects of that past today.
Exactly. And as we've been digging into these Arabic sources about slavery in ancient Egypt, it really hits me how our understanding in history is always changing.
Yeah.
We might think we have a clear picture, then new perspectives and sources come along like the ones you've brought, and suddenly things get a lot more complicated.
Totally. We've gone way beyond the usual stuff, and it's given us a whole new view. But for our listeners, what's the most important takeaway? What's the one thing you hope they'll remember from this deep dive?
I think it's the power of individual stories.
Yeah.
You have talked about the big stuff, the wars, the monuments, the economics.
Right.
But it's those personal stories of resilience, resistance, even joy that really make this time come alive.
I'm right there with you. Those stories make it all so real, so human. It's easy to get lost in the big ideas when we talk about ancient civilizations. Yeah.
But remembering that they were made up of people with their own hopes and dreams and struggles, that's what makes it all important.
It's like you're looking through a window into the past, and all of a sudden you see those individual faces looking back at you. History isn't just dates and battles. It's about the choices people made, the lives they lived, the things they left behind.
It's powerful stuff. And it makes me think, how can we use these lessons from ancient Egypt in our world today? I mean, thankfully, we don't have pharaohs building pyramids anymore,
Right.
but we still have inequality and exploitation. Are there any parallels, any warnings we should pay attention to?
That's a good question. We might not have those pharaohs, but systems of unfairness and taking advantage of others still exist today. Look at how people are treated in some jobs, the economic gaps between people,
Yeah.
even how some groups are pushed aside and not allowed to speak up. Those echoes from the past, those patterns of power and control, they can really stick around.
You're right. It's like history is always trying to tell us something, offering lessons we don't always hear. So how do we avoid making those same mistakes? Well, first of all, we need to know about them. By studying the past, by understanding how these systems have worked throughout history, we can see those patterns better in our own time.
So it's like knowledge is power.
Exactly. The more we know about the past, the better we can handle the present and build a fairer, more equal future. It's all about seeing those echoes of history, those warning signs, and making different choices.
That's really powerful. So as we wrap up this amazing deep dive into ancient Egyptian slavery, what's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with?
I think it goes back to those individual stories. The fact that even in a system as bad as slavery, people found ways to resist, to connect, to hold on to what made them human. It shows just how strong the human spirit is.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even in the worst times, hope and strength can win. And maybe, just maybe, by understanding those stories, by letting those voices from the past be heard, we can create a world that's more fair and caring today.
That's beautiful. It's been incredible going through these Arabic sources and discovering a side of ancient Egypt that most people never see. I feel like we've just started to explore, and I bet our listeners are feeling inspired to dig even deeper into this fascinating part of history. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.